Right. Well, it wasn't as miserable today, was it, as far as the heat goes? 2 or 3 degrees makes a big difference, we found anyways. But good to be here with you all, and unless there's anything that needs to be announced before we start, I'll go ahead and just start with a word of prayer. Close prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this time that we have together to encourage one another, and this will be a fruitful hour of study, and that we go away prepared to finish the week strong and to be a shining light in whatever situation we might find ourselves in during the remainder of this week. We just pray that your blessings be upon us. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we've been doing this study on one another. And, part of the reason why I chose this was because the high school class is going to be out here, and I also think it's just a fruitful step for, all of us. And so last week, we talked about loving one another, which, when you think about it, that's really the basis for every other passage that you'll look at on that list. I think every other passage that you see is, at the very least, an expression and is tied to love. And so we see an example of that. Last week we also talked about forgiveness, that those two things almost seem to go hand in hand, because if you don't love your brother, what happens?
You ain't doing the right thing.
That's right. You're missing something, right? And John tells us basically you're not born of God, that you've missed the biggest thing that there is, and that basically you're not really a Christian, to put that in simple terms. And so with that, we talked about forgiveness, because if our attitude is that we're just never going to forgive, whoever it might be, maybe somebody genuinely wronged us, but we've determined in our heart that I'm never going to forgive this person, no matter what they do. What can we also expect with that type of attitude? Yeah, because whatever measure of judgment we use is going to be used back on us. And so if we fail to forgive others, then why should I expect that God's going to forgive me? And so I see those two things being tied closely. But as we think about loving each other, I always kind of stop and think and wonder, okay, what does that actually look like? Because how many of us are actually going to be in a position where we're going to, be dying for each other, right? Physically, that's probably not going to happen. And at the same time, forgiveness is just one small aspect, right? Because what about those who we don't have issues with, all right? How do I express love towards somebody outside of just forgiveness? And so again, that's where this study is helpful, because what you're going to see is just a list of really practical things. I think it kind of puts it in perspective and gives us some ideas of what it looks like to love each other. And I think that you're going to see these aren't crazy things. These aren't things that you could only do in an idealistic situation. Actually, when you look at them, they're very simple. Most of them we probably don't need to spend 45 minutes on it, because when I talk about it, you're going to immediately have an idea of what that looks like in your mind. And so I think part of this is fruitful just by having our eyes look at these different passages and having them ingrained in our hearts. And so this week I want to talk about just simply encouraging one another. That's probably one of the easiest things that we can do, and yet coming across people who are good at encouraging and perfecting that in our own lives is a totally different story. And so this is just a few passages to look at. These are, I think all of them should be on your handout. But 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 18, encourage one another with these words. And in that passage, Paul is instructing the believers there that, hey, we're not to sorrow like those who have no hope, as far as when we see our loved ones who have died in Christ. He gives them this lengthy, encouraging passage about how we have hope, and that they're going to be the first to rise in Christ. And then we're also going to rise, and we're going to be joined in heaven, caught up with the Lord. And so he says, encourage one another with these words. He says also in Thessalonians to encourage one another and build each other up as you are already doing. And so just because we study these things, and we might be doing them to an extent, Paul, he's telling the Thessalonians, keep doing it. You have that famous passage where he tells them to excel still more. We're never to be satisfied as Christians with what we're doing. We can always see opportunities to do more and to improve and to grow. And so Hebrews 3 and verse 13, you see that word encourage pop up quite a bit, actually, throughout that book. But he says, encourage each other daily while it's still called today, so that none of you is hardened by sin's deception. And we'll talk more about this passage in a bit. And then Hebrews 10, and this is 24 and 25, that's that section that we like to quote to people when they miss or skip the Sunday. We say, hey, that Hebrews 10:24 says you got to be there every week, right? But that passage is about more than just showing up on Sunday mornings. It's actually involving something we're supposed to be doing all the time. And so he says, not neglecting to gather together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging each other, and all the more as you see the day approaching. So this is something that's more than just we're worshiping our God, but when they were getting together, it was more often than on Sundays, that was an opportunity to also encourage each other. And the first step to encouraging each other is to be in each other's presence. And so those are just a few of the passages. And really, when you look at the one another passages, that's basically it for that word encourage. But that word encourage pops up over 100 times in different contexts, and it's translated in a variety of ways. It's translated as implore, to invite, to entreat, to urge, and it kind of requires context to figure out what exactly is being said and how to translate that word. And so when you look it up, the word, it's basically it literally means to call somebody to your side. So that's what the word encourage means. The Greek word's parakaleo. How does that maybe help us understand what Paul is trying to tell us when he tells us to encourage one another? How does that definition help us envision what's being talked about here?
Well, he tells everybody to, if you don't forgive your brother, God won't forgive you.
Yep. True, yeah. But this definition of encourage, again, this idea, it's calling somebody to your side. How does that help us picture what the whole point is and what this idea, we translate it as encourage. But how does this definition help get the point across of what we're really supposed to be doing? Okay, all right. Support, yeah. A lot of times when I think of the word encourage, I think of, okay, it's my job to make somebody who isn't happy and make them happy. Is that what it means to encourage somebody? No? Okay. 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 All right. So what's really the goal? What's the point? And what are we trying to do when we encourage somebody? If we're not trying to say, hey, you should be happy, even though your life is terrible right now. If that's not the goal, then what is the goal? I mean, Andy says empathy. I think that's an important part of it. It's not very empathetic to treat somebody who's going through something awful like it's no big deal. But what else? Yeah.
But if you're really working to encourage somebody, you build them up and you strengthen them to accomplish whatever they have in mind.
Right. Yeah. So you're, in some cases, trying to strengthen this person so that they're, able to serve to a higher capacity in some cases. But certainly our goal is not to do the opposite, to discourage. I think that does kind of help get the point across. Go ahead, Ben.
Encouragement that God said if you forgive him, he'll forgive you.
Yeah.
What other encouragement do you need?
Yeah. When it comes to forgiveness, that's true.
You need all the help we can get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt about that. That's for sure. Go ahead, Ben.
The mental picture I got with that definition of call to one side is a coach on the athletic field or the court when the kid does something by mistake or he does something well. What the coach do? He pulls him to the side
Yeah.
and he lets him know.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, and we'll probably talk more about, there's a word that's closely related to this, and that's to edify, and we'll look at that probably in another class. But when you think about encouragement, that doesn't always simply involve complimenting somebody and highlighting their achievements. I mean, you look at the picture behind me, and it kind of looks like, the guy on the right's taller than the guy on the left, so I assume maybe it's a father and a son. But can a father encourage a son even when a father is perhaps offering some constructive criticism? Are they able to do that in an encouraging way? Or should they be able to do that in an encouraging way? Yeah. I mean, there's a right way to do that and a wrong way. And so when you look at this word encourage, again, it's used 109 times. Sometimes it's used in the context of like encouraging people to do good works, right? And so this isn't complimenting them for something they've already done. It's motivating them to maybe do better, to do something that they aren't doing. And so, you have a lot of senses in which that word is used. One of the guys in the Bible who isn't talked about maybe as much as he should be is Barnabas, right? His original name was Joseph, but we all call him Barnabas. Why do we all call him Barnabas? Yeah, and I have a cheat sheet behind me too, right? So his name was Joseph. And it says that he was called by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a Levite, a native of Cyprus. And I think that's cool because, Barnabas wasn't included in that original number of the apostles, but he was doing work that was just as important as what they were doing. And it seems like it started with him having this reputation of being an encourager. And I think you have an example of that in his treatment with the apostle Paul. So what's an example where we see Barnabas who kind of living up to this name with the apostle Paul? What does he do for Paul? Yeah. 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 And kind of recognizing something in Paul that nobody else could see. And I love when you go back and read that. We won't go to it, but it's in Acts 9. And it says that the Greek literally says that Barnabas took hold of Paul. That it seems like, we say something like we take somebody under our wing, right? But you see Barnabas having this encourager-type relationship with Paul, and we see how that worked out, where Paul goes on and accomplishes great things. And I've seen that happen in the church. I remember seeing one kid in particular who just didn't have his life together, I guess you could say. And we did a summer camp, kind of like FC Friends, but not. And he won, which I always thought it was a dumb award, but the Camper of the Week, right? He won that, because normally I hated the award because it would always go to somebody that everybody already thinks is awesome anyways. But he won that award, and I saw that kid's whole life change. To me, that was the point where there's this major pivot, and he got this encouragement in his life, and it just kind of set him on a whole different course. It's amazing what just one word of encouragement can do for somebody, and I think that we can think back in our lives of some nice things that were said to us that still stick to us or with us, years later. Do you think that encouragers are more common or less common than discouragers? What do you think? Okay. Yeah. I don't know. It's kind of subjective. I think they're common here. I think you go out into the world, and we tend to come across people often that are, discouraging more than encouraging. And I came across this quote that I wanted to share with you guys. This is William Barclay. He says, "One of the highest of human duties is the duty of encouragement. It is easy to laugh at men's ideals. It is easy to pour cold water on their enthusiasm. It is easy to discourage others. The world is full of discouragers. We have a Christian duty to encourage one another. Many a time, a word of praise or thanks or appreciation or cheer has kept a man on his feet. Blessed is the man who speaks such a word." It's kind of a subjective thing. Maybe we feel like there are more encouragers in the world. But when I think about people who are really exceptional at encouraging, there's certainly, this is kind of a skill that some people seem to be better at than others. Those people who are really good at encouraging, they just do seem kind of rare, don't they? And I think that we all appreciate them when we come across them. And so what is it about discouraging that's easier? Why do we see people that are often inclined to discourage? Why is it that we ourselves are sometimes inclined to discourage? Do you think? Yeah.
But the difference is the experience, skill, and the discipline, practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Frank, were you about to say something? No? Okay. Somebody else was about to say something. Yeah, I think you're right. It's definitely a skill that needs to be developed. I think that sometimes for myself, we can get more fixated on being encouraged than necessarily doing the encouraging. And sometimes what can happen in a congregation of God's people is you can get a bunch of people who are discouraged, and they're waiting to be encouraged by somebody else. And sometimes what we need to do to get that ball rolling is just, be the one that steps out and says, I'm going to be the encourager. I think that we also have a habit to kind of look at things negatively. So when somebody has an idea, right, I like what he says, it's easy to laugh at men's ideals. So sometimes somebody might have a good idea. Maybe somebody wants to go on a door-knocking campaign, and we're not too excited about doing something like that. And we can come up with a million reasons why it's a bad and stupid idea and we shouldn't do it. But that's easy. When somebody comes up with an idea and you see them wanting to put effort in and serve God, that's our opportunity to encourage that person and help build them up and point them in the right direction. It's hard to offer praise and thanks and appreciation and cheer because those are sometimes things that I think that we want for ourselves. But I appreciate what Andy said. It's a skill. And sometimes it's a matter of just looking for the positives in life, getting out of my own head and looking at the people around me and figuring out, okay, how can I be an encourager with the current group of people that I'm with, whether it's in church or, in your work environment. But you look in the Bible and sometimes encouragement is unusual. I think this is also true for our young people. That when you're growing up in school, and I think that we can think back to when we were growing up in school, how often do we come across encouragers as opposed to discouragers? I think that's an opportunity for young people to kind of stand out in that regard. But you look in the Bible, and when they were going into the promised land, of course they made a bunch of mistakes on the way. And what was kind of the thing that put the nail in the coffin? Where God said, you're not going into the promised land. What happened? Yeah, people were discouraged by the 10. So it started with the 10 being discouraged. And then what did the 10 do? They went back to camp, and then they kind of, what did they say? You kind of touched on it.
Yeah, we can't take the land. The cities are fortified, and it's full of giants, and we look like grasshoppers in our own sight.
Right.
Pretty soon people are already stuck up and go back east.
Right. And the problem with that is that they were given specific promises that if they went into the land, it would be theirs. But when they went into the land, they focused on all the problems, all the obstacles, all the things that we would have to overcome, and it just seems really unlikely that we can take these guys. And so they go back, and that's basically what they say to the Israelites. And so some of the passages that kind of look back on this, this is, when Moses is trying to, encourage some of the other tribes of Israel, but he's reminding them of what their fathers did. He said, when they went up to the valley of Eshcol and saw the land, they discouraged the heart of the people of Israel from going into the land that the Lord had given them. And so it was, 10-2, right? You had 10 people who, the majority won, right? You had 2 encouraging voices, but they were drowned out by the 10. Looking back on this again in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 28, he says, where are we going up? Our brothers have made our hearts melt. He's quoting their own words in this book of Deuteronomy. And he's saying that, when they heard the report from the spies, this is what he said, our brothers have made our hearts melt. You know, you look in the Bible, and sometimes you see Israel's heart melt, and it's in, you know, when they're facing a big enemy. And I guess that's kind of the case here, but I think it's more the case that they were encouraged, or discouraged rather, by their own brothers, by their own people. I think that we can see that happen in the church. He says that our brothers made our hearts melt. The people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. And besides, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there. And so they got a million reasons why this plan will never work, instead of focusing on the promises of God. So I have a repeat there. So I have this other quote that kind of stuck out to me.
For forgiveness, everybody should have had my day. Because that was his big day.
Yep.
And well, I had a bunch of stuff on my mind. I don't know.
That's okay. We can talk about it later. But I guess what I want us to see is that discouragement is really powerful. Discouragement is really powerful, and we can kind of develop a presence of ourselves. And some of us, we can develop a habit of being discouraging if we're not careful, where we only recognize the negatives, where we only see the problems. And so I came across this quote by a guy's name that I never heard of before, but I thought it was pretty good because I think it describes something that we've all experienced before, and it describes a discourager. It says, here's a man like a cloud. All right, the cloud's moving in, right? In a cloud without any silver lining. He gets between you and the sun. He makes everything dark. He puts the worst constructions and attributes the worst motives and takes the darkest view. Haven't we come across people like that? Where they offer a constructive criticism, but it's like the worst, it's not constructive, right? Or they see us mess up and they just assume that we had wrong motives, that we had some sort of ought against them. They assume the worst about us. Or they take the darkest view. But he goes on, he says, you do not like to meet the mirksome man. You do not wish to be overcast. And so that's the case with people who are discouraging, where I'm not talking about people who are depressed or beaten down, but I'm talking about people who just seem to always point out the negatives. Those are people that, do we enjoy being around that? I think we can all agree that no, we don't enjoy being around that. And so that's what this guy is saying. He says, you do not wish to be overcast. He says, perhaps today you are hopeful. You have difficulties, but by God's blessing you can work out. Your church is struggling, but you think you see a brighter day. You have some sorry apples in your basket, but you've gotten the big ones onto the top. You have a skeleton or two in your closet, but they're out of sight. The sun is shining today up on the high places and valleys of your landscapes. And he goes on to say, and here comes that human cloud. Right? You can have the best week, but here comes that discouraging person in our lives with this shadow creeping on before him. You avoid him. You take the other side of the street because you know in 10 minutes he would get all the small apples on the top of your basket. He would have all the skeletons out of your closet because he likes their company. You escape him because you do not want him to cool your iron, for it is hot and you have made up your mind to strike it. Such a man may be a Christian, but he has a great besetting sin, which he must watch and pray against. Have we come across people who are kind of like that before? Yeah, and they don't see it in themselves, right? And sometimes I think we've all probably been that person at one time or another, where we're the discourager. And so that's powerful. We can suck the air out of a room just with our presence if we have a reputation for just constantly, being the discourager. And so it goes without saying, we need to work on developing habits, at least avoiding the habit of being discouraging. But is it enough? Are you necessarily an encourager simply because you've avoided being a discourager? Is that the same thing? No. It takes more than that, right? It's not just a matter of being neutral and saying, I never put people down. I never discourage people when they have maybe a good idea. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm an encourager either. When you think about this idea of encouraging one another, that's something active that we're supposed to be doing. That's something that we're supposed to be adding to our behavior. And just like discouragement is powerful. Guess what else is powerful? Encouragement, right? You see how, and we all know that one comment, right? One small comment, one small negative comment, how long does that stick with us? What's that? Yeah, years. And sometimes you don't even remember what a person said, but you remember how it felt more than anything. Well, it works the same way when people encourage us. That can stick with us for years, and again, it can set a different trajectory for our whole lives. And so we all know who J.R.R. Tolkien is, right? He's the author of Lord of the Rings. Did you know that he did not plan on publishing his work until it was C.S. Lewis who kind of kept encouraging him to do it? He worked on it for something like 7 or 10 years. And it was C.S. Lewis who kept telling him to do it. And he said he was, for a long time, my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. Before his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought the Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. So he wasn't even going to finish the story if it weren't for C.S. Lewis, and now it's one of the widest read books, and they've made movies about it, and now they're making another TV show about it. And he says it was because C.S. Lewis encouraged me. We might not encourage people to the point where they write a best-selling series, but we can make a difference in people's lives based off of the things we say and the way that we treat them if it's in an encouraging manner. So I want to go back to this verse that I mentioned earlier. He says, "Watch out, brothers and sisters, so that there won't be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage each other daily, while it is still called today, so that none of you is hardened by sin's deception." So in this instruction that we're given, how important is it, just from this verse, to encourage? How powerful is encouragement according to this verse?
We should encourage everybody to do the right thing and come to church. You have to talk to them a lot better than I can talk. But if you a good smooth talker, you can get people in.
Yeah, good smooth talker. I like that. Well, I like what you're saying, because people need to be encouraged to be here on Sundays, and it's important that people know that we're encouraged just by their presence sometimes, right? Right? What is... Sorry, keep going. I cut you off. Yeah. I didn't hear you talking still. What? Okay, all right. But when you look at this passage, going along with what Dan said, it says daily, but what is it kind of solving? What's it contrasted to?
It's solving for unbelieving part of the turn away from God. Why does it turn away? Because of sin and deception. It's sin to deceive some brother or sister in life. That if you can turn away from God and encourage them to see.
Exactly.
But when you think about the consequence of lack of encouragement being something that's profound that distracts you.
Yeah, I mean, you said it better than I could. When you keep on reading this passage, what is it the Hebrew writer refers the readers back to? If you have your Bibles open, go ahead and turn there to Hebrews 3. He says, "For who heard and rebelled?" Talking about who heard the word of God and chose to rebel anyways. He says, "Wasn't it all who came out of Egypt under Moses, with whom was God angry for 40 years? Wasn't it those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? And so we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief." But he mentions it seems like something that can prevent somebody turning away from God, something that can help somebody avoid unbelief. It seems like he's saying something that can help with that is encouragement. I think that goes back to what you saw with those 12 spies, where you had 10 people that were able to discourage a whole nation. And if all 10 of those guys were saying what Joshua and Caleb were saying, how would that have changed Israel's trajectory? if they were all saying we can do it, we have God's promises, this is what he has said to us, let's be confident in it. God's already given them over to us. If they all 12 had that attitude, you would never read about that 40 years spent in the wilderness. But the nation listened to the 10. And those encouraging voices got drowned out. And so I think we should take notice that he says, encourage each other daily. I read that, and this isn't something that is just for, one particular group of people. Romans 12 mentions encouraging as being a gift, like in line with prophecy. But that doesn't mean that, I'm not really good at encouraging, so therefore I don't have to do it. That's somebody else who has the gift of encouragement. If I'm not good at encouraging, what do I got to do? Work on it. I should work on it. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, and along that line, I never noticed this. It says encourage each other daily while it's still called the day, so that none of you. He doesn't say so that none of them. He says none of you, which would include the encouragement.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing how when you encourage somebody, isn't it like 9 times out of 10, which this isn't why we should encourage, but when you encourage somebody, what tends to happen? Yeah, you do. Because you see how it impacts them, but then often, a lot of times, people will say, you know what, you said this, but I've been thinking this about you. And, it kind of opens up this door of communication that you otherwise wouldn't have had. So it's really important we work on this skill. I had this boss, and I don't know if it was his management style or what, but it just brought out the worst in me from the standpoint that it affected my job performance. Not because I was angry or anything like that, but because I was just nervous whenever this boss would come around. And I'm pretty sure that his management philosophy was one where his goal was to make it so that nobody knew where they stood with him. Have you ever had a boss like that? Who comes up and you don't know, he could hate you, you could be his favorite employee, but he's not going to show you his cards. And I was just, I did not handle that well as a people pleaser, and I remember I was working the gas pump. This was in Oregon, so we had to pump gas for people. And they had this video of me where the people I was serving, I said, you can go, but I forgot the pump was still in there, so they drove off with the hose, and gas was just spewing out of the pump. And I didn't know how to stop it. I was just panicked, right? And so that was kind of an underlying thing in my relationship with this guy. Like, okay, did he forgive me for that? Does he think I'm an idiot? I never knew where I stood with him. And that was almost more discouraging than if he would have just told me, hey, I don't like you, you're not a good worker. It seemed to bring out the worst in me. I'm not the type of person that responds to that. I think most of us aren't the type of people who respond to that. We respond when people encourage us, and that's what gives us momentum. And so I read this passage, and I think encouragement is to be a habit amongst all Christians. Right? It's not enough just to avoid discouragement, but to be actively encouraging others. And I think this is the goal. Encouragement amongst believers is designed to help other believers continue in belief, if that makes sense. And we already touched on that. And so I just think this is really powerful when we consider this and consider that passage. And so obviously, the way we encourage people with our words, right? Again, noticing something about somebody, maybe we already admire them, but all we're doing is putting a spotlight on something that we've already noticed, right? In other words, what we want to avoid is flattery, right? Flattery, people can read right through flattery. There's nothing worse than learning how to preach, okay? Because you start off and you're terrible, right? And then, you get a little less terrible as life goes on. But when you're starting off, like, nobody knows that you did a worse job better than yourself. And then you can get people coming up to you and saying, hey, that was a great sermon. But in your mind, okay, maybe they were genuine, but in your mind, it's like, they're probably saying that to me just to encourage me. And it works out not being super encouraging, right? We're not interested in flattery. You can read through that. But there's enough that a person does. We shouldn't have to flatter somebody or make something up in order to encourage somebody. We should just be able to recognize something about them that we actually admire and put a spotlight on that. And we can, of course, encourage with our actions, through doing things for people. And I think Natalie and I are just really encouraged by all the kindness that you all have shown towards us. So you're already doing that one for sure. But then going back to this idea of encouraging people with the scriptures. I can't tell you how many times I've been discouraged and somebody quotes a verse to me. And, they say it they listen to what I'm saying and then they say something like, I really love this verse that says, da-da-da-da-da. And it's like, wow, that was the perfect verse. That's exactly what I needed to hear. I think we're to be a people who are equipped with the scriptures in such a way where we can use God's promises to comfort others. So it's kind of interesting, this idea of encourage and this Greek word that you find, often it's translated as comfort, where we are actually providing comfort towards people. And I think this is kind of the idea in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which was a verse we already kind of looked at. But he's reminding them where their dead relatives are, right? And that's a sensitive subject. And people say all sorts of foolish things. I remember my parents, or I don't remember because I wasn't alive, but my parents tell me a story about when they lost their 6-month-old child. And my parents must have been about maybe 30 at the time, around my age. And somebody came up to them and said, well, you guys are still young. You can have another one. And it's like, isn't that the worst thing? That's like the worst thing you could say to somebody. It's like, no, you can't have that one, right? That one is gone. The one that we wanted is gone. We handle these types of things pretty poorly sometimes. But when you read what Paul says, he tells us to use these words and encourage each other with them. And he's talking about those who we love that have passed, but they're going to be risen one day. And there's tons of verses that we can use to encourage others. When somebody's facing temptation, we have passages that say, God will provide the way of escape. We have promises that are given to us that we should constantly be using to encourage one another. And so, of course, there's loads of ideas that you could probably imagine that I didn't think of, but those were just a few things. Go ahead.
You said at peace in your comment. Just yesterday, somebody shared with me the thought that encouraging words never start with the phrase at peace.
Oh, yeah.
I just think of all the probably sarcastic thoughts
Yeah.
about
Yeah, totally. I remember I told somebody, I don't know why I said it, it was just like the word that was in my mind, but they were filling in for me to preach, and I said, oh man, I'm sure you'll do an adequate job, and they got back to me, they're like, adequate? What do you mean adequate? I was like, yeah, that wasn't the best word, right? So I wasn't very good at encouraging there. We got to choose our words carefully, because look, we're human, and we know how much we read into the words people say to us, right? And other people are doing the same thing. But you see the need for encouragement. I mean, I think about a guy like the Apostle Paul, who had, witnessed Jesus risen from the dead, who was just this highly functioning Christian, who perhaps outside of Jesus accomplished more for the church than any other Christian. And yet I see a guy who is giving thanks for what I believe he received encouragement from this guy, Onesiphorus, and his household. He says, may the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, because he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. On the contrary, when he was in Rome, he diligently searched for me and found me. You have this guy that we know nothing else about except that he often refreshed Paul while he was in prison. And in this passage, Paul is talking about, before that, how other people turned away from him. They left him when he went in jail. But here's this guy who went to Rome and sought out Paul, and how much did Paul benefit from that in this imprisonment as he was facing death? If Paul needed encouragement, I think it's safe to say that we all need encouragement. And that's one thing that I learned, I think, through the pandemic. There's people that I looked up to before the pandemic, spiritual leaders, whether it was elders, whether it was preachers, strong spiritual families, people that were like mothers in the faith to me, or still are. And I saw so many of those people I looked up to become discouraged. It was just a testament to me, never assume that somebody doesn't need encouragement. Because what we find is these people we look up to, what are they often busy doing? What do they do all the time for other people? They encourage. But who's encouraging them, right? It's really easy to become depleted, to get exhausted, to get burnt out. And so this isn't something just for leadership to do. This is something we all need to do, and it's something that everybody needs. Not to put our only elder who's here tonight on the spot. But Steve, do elders need encouragement? Yeah, yeah. Because during the pandemic, basically their job was to make a choice that's going to make half the people upset, right? And I'm sure that you guys love doing that. No, not really. Nobody enjoys that. Everybody needs encouragement. Go ahead, Ben.
Talking about the pandemic
Yeah.
and how many people became discouraged just because they couldn't go to work, couldn't go to school, etc.
Mhm.
But yet some of these same people have their loved ones in nursing homes and never go visit. Period.
Yep.
We're living a two-faced Christianity. Selfish about ourselves and forget our others.
That's where we get more focused on me being encouraged, and when I should be thinking about how can I encourage others, right? It kind of made me laugh because when, this is going to sound bad that I worded it that way, but when the Andover tornado happened, I saw this video. Of course, the tornado wasn't funny, but there's this video where it was horrible. That tornado came through and wiped out the YMCA, right? You guys see that footage? Just absolute destruction. But the part that made me laugh is you had people that were coming out of the wreckage, and they don't know anything yet. They don't know if people have died. They don't know if somebody's lost their loved ones. But all you hear is one guy going, "My car, my car!" And I think that's just like kind of what Ben said. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't want to lose my car in a tornado, all right? But, somebody else could be going through something worse than, losing a possession or kind of some of the things that Ben was talking about. And so, yeah, anyways, that was just kind of interesting to me. This last verse, 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 14. When we talk about who needs encouragement, and encouragement is something that I think can be preventive. It's not that we're to wait for people to be discouraged. You don't have to wait for that in order to encourage somebody. But I think we do need to have a heart for those who maybe we see and can recognize that they are discouraged. And what can I do to lift them up? And this is what Paul says: "We urge you, brothers, admonish the idle and encourage the faint-hearted." The word faint-hearted, it literally means to have like a little soul is really what it means if you were to translate that literally. It's like inside you feel like you're this big. And so they translate it faint-hearted. We come across people like that, and I know that sometimes it's hard to be that person, to encourage somebody. And maybe this is somebody that's been discouraged for a long, long time that maybe we come across in life or that has been in our life. But I think that's why he says, look, help the weak, be patient with them all. Sometimes that's what it requires. It's not just giving somebody one compliment on a Sunday or something like that, or doing one nice thing for somebody, but it's going to take consistency. It's going to take patience when we're trying to encourage somebody who's faint-hearted. Let's encourage one another and do our best in order to fulfill this great command that Paul has given us. Is there any other thoughts or comments as we wrap up? All right. Well, thank you. You guys have all been encouraging me tonight, so appreciate it. What's up, dude? You here by yourself tonight?
At least you get life in work.
At least I have hair.